Hi there once again and welcome to another Expresso mechanic tutorial. And in this one we're going to be producing what you see on the screen, which is of course the simulation of an explosion. In order to create the desired result, we're going to be using a combination of Expresso, dynamics, thinking particles and pyro. And we'll also use a Voronoi fracture. That's what we're going to be about in this tutorial. So without further ado, let's see if we can make this happen. We'll start by bringing in a sphere, and its radius we'll leave at 100 and we'll leave the segments at 32. It won't be a standard type though, we'll use an icosahedron, and we will leave the render perfect on. It really doesn't make any difference. Now, the next thing we need to do is place a displacer in our sphere. So we'll hold down the shift, grab a hold of the displacer and drop that in. The strength and the height we'll leave as they are, and also the type and the direction. No need to adjust any of these. What we're interested in is the shading. We need a custom shader and we'll use a noise. In our noise, the type we will change to mod noise because I found that this worked quite nicely, and we'll make the global scale 300. And that gives us a sort of nice Boulder sort of shape. I found that was quite nice. If you don't agree, by all means choose a different noise and have a play around and see what you can come up with. But I felt that was good enough for my purposes. Fantastic. So we've got it that far. And we can think about what we're going to do next. Now, in order to make this thing explode, it's got to be fractured. So the next thing that we need to reach for will be a Voronoi fracture. So we'll select the sphere, hold down the option key, and bring the Voronoi in. And we can see that things are starting to work. I don't wish to colorize the fragments, so I won't bother with that. But we do need to work with our sources. So we'll just check the sources tab. And with our point generator distribution here, we need to work with our distribution type, and we need to change that to exponential. And the standard deviation, we can play around in here too if we wish to. We can make this 0.11, and our axes, I'm going to switch off the X, the Y make minus, and that pushes the points more towards the top. And our point amount, I'm going to increase this to 120. So I want a lot of points. And our seed, I'm just going to make this 1, 2, 3, 4, 6. But you can play around with this as much as you like, and I'm also going to check high quality. So I've got my Voronoi fracture set the way I want it. And that's great, that's nice. Now apart from this, the only thing we need to worry about with regard to our other tabs here is the selections. If we click on that, I just want to say inside faces, and you'll see why a little bit later. We'll be using that a bit later in the tutorial. Okay, fabulous. So we've got it that far. The one thing I do need to bring in is a flat plane. I also need to move my Voronoi fracture to 100 in the Y so that my boulder is resting on what will be the floor. So the plane will just make this bigger. We'll make it 4000 by 4000. And that gives us a nice area to work with. And then we can think about moving on from here and working out some dynamics. For a start, we can give our plane a collider tag. And then our Voronoi fracture, we can give that a rigid body. I will check custom initial velocity. And in this shoot at, we need something in there too. And I'm going to bring a null into the scene and just place it around 700 in the Y. And if we just go to our top view, what I'll do is just bring it slightly forward so that it's slightly off, and also slightly off towards the left of the boulder. Or in fact it's the right of the boulder, isn't it? It's the left as we look at it, but it's actually the boulder's right. Let's just switch back to our 3D view, so F1. So we've got our target, and we'll just rename that target. We might as well call the Voronoi Boulder. Switch back to our dynamics, and we'll think about bringing this target into here. So we're going to shoot, and we can see that we've got a line there pointing in the direction of the actual target. Now, we also need to check custom initial angular velocity. And we can put some numbers in here. Now, I found that 5, 7 and 4 were a pretty good sweet spot. And the speed, we can make 1800 because we want this to explode, so we want quite a lot of speed. Apart from that, we don't really need to change anything. That's all good. The collisions, nothing in here. Don't need to worry about anything. We can leave the collision shapes as auto, that's fine. And we don't need to worry about our mass or our forces. And our cache, we will be working with very shortly. Okay. So we've got our dynamics set up. If we just play the timeline, let's see what happens. And straight away, we're getting a nice explosive effect, aren't we? It's doing exactly what we'd like it to do. So that is really pleasant. That's pleasing on the eye. Let's just go back to our 3D view F1. And then we can just see this. And there we go. That's a nice effect. And we can see that we've got a combination of small fragments at the top, which come out of the top, and also the larger fragments as well. And that's giving it quite, I think, just a nice looking shape as it explodes. Yeah, really quite nice. Okay, fantastic. Now, as I said, we would use the cache. Now, what I'm going to do is actually do that now. So if we say calculate cache, we can see that it's off and it's doing its job. The only thing I will do, though, is just stop it there. I mean, this is fine, that's worked. But what I want is 300 frames, so I want a bit more time to work with. So let's just calculate that cache again. Let it go for 300 frames. Because we've got to remember we're going to be using Pyro, and Pyro needs a little bit more time in order for the smoke and fire to dissipate. So that's why we need about 300 frames. Okay, great. So we've got that. Now, the beautiful thing about this cache is that we don't have to start it at 0. We can offset it, and we're going to need to do that because we need to start at 150 frames. Because I've got a fuse that I've got to create, which will be used to trigger the actual detonation. Of course, in reality, it would be connected to some dynamite, but on this occasion, we're not going to be simulating that. So that's going to be our next step, but we can see now that this will wait if we play the timeline, and then it will explode. So that's fine. That's allowing me to do what I want to do with my fuse. And that's going to be the next step. We're going to build a 5-second fuse. We'll switch to our top view, so F2, and zoom out so that we can see where we are. We can see where the edge of our plane is. I'll reach for the spline pen tool and we can start work on this. In fact, I'll get a little bit closer, and then we can just click here. We'll come around the back of there, over to somewhere here, and then down to somewhere here. Hit escape, and then we can start moving our tangents. Just having a quick adjustment with those so that we just get a nicer shape. And there we go. That should do quite nicely. Let's just switch back to our 3D view, so F1. And the end of our fuse is here. We can zoom in slightly and bring this down so that we set it somewhere around here. That's what I want to do. Just move a little bit there. Set that somewhere there. That's okay for now. If we need to adjust later, we can easily do so. Again, I'll switch back to my top view and just make sure that I've got that where I need it. I think I'll just turn that around there. Hit escape. And this one here, we can just move that over here. And if we wish to, let's just click on that. We can just move this one so that it's just about touching the boulder. Okay, so F1 back to our 3D view. The next thing to do will be to bring in a circle, and the circle needs to be 1 centimetre in radius. Select both of these, hold down Command and Option and drop them into a sweep. And what I'll do with the sweep, I'll just rename this fuse wire, and then we'll, in our basic tab, change its colour so that we can see it really easily. Just make it a nice dark colour, and that's better. We can see that clearly now. So our fuse is set up thus far. The next thing we need to do, we've got to think about how we're going to make the fuse burn. Now, our object here, we've got end growth, and we can work with that. That's the first thing that we can do. That's obviously going to work perfectly well. But we also need to put an end, which is lit effectively, on the end of our fuse wire. So we need to simulate that burning end. The way we're going to do that is to bring in a circle, or rather, I beg your pardon, a sphere, and change its radius to 1. It needs to be a hemisphere, and we need to give this an align to spline tag, and the spline will be our spline here, so we'll drag that in from our fuse wire. Tangential, we'll click that, and if we go into our top view and take a look at what we've got at the start of our fuse, let's have a quick look, see where we are. Now, at the moment, the position is wrong because it's at the other end of the spline. We need this to be 100%. And now we've got our sphere in the correct position, but we can see that it's not orientated correctly. So we need to make it editable. So we'll hit C, select the object, and we'll select the axis, and we'll work with this. We'll rotate the axis, and we want to rotate it 90 degrees. And there we go. It's now in the correct position, and we can see that we've got this end here. Now, we'll switch back to our 3D view, select the sphere, hit O for object so that we can see what we've got. If we switch to garage shading lines, we can see that we've got half of the sphere above ground level at the moment. Now, we want to work with this and just do a little bit of a change here. What we need to do is select all of this, and in our coordinates we just need to move it up 1 in the Y. In fact, 0.5, I beg your pardon, is better, and that way it's still on the floor. It's now touching the floor. That's good. That's where we need it to be. Okay, but we need to make a selection of polygons on this end, and you'll see why a little bit later. So what I'm going to do is switch to polygon mode, and I'm going to switch to my right hand view, so F3, and hit O for object again, and now I can see where I am. I'll get my brush selection, check off visible only, and I want the polygons that are above the ground, and that will be all of these. I've got those. I'll just switch to rectangular selection now, hold down Shift and select those. So I've got all of them selected. And if I switch back to my 3D view, so F1, we can see that I've made that selection. I've got one missing. I can easily add that. Let's just get the brush selection, hold down the Shift and select. And now I should have all of those selected, and that's fine. That's looking good. If we've probably still got one missing here, which we can just add. It doesn't really matter. As long as it's accurate enough, that's fine. So I've got those selected, and I can say in my select menu here, store selection. So that's ready, and we've got that we can use. what we're actually going to be doing is using thinking particles, and we're going to be emitting the thinking particles from this selection. So that's why I didn't want this, because if I emit from here, they're going to go through the floor. No point in that. I want them all to go upwards, and that's why I'm doing this. Okay, so we've got things that far. The next thing we need to do is keyframe both this sphere and our fuse wire, and that's going to be our next step to get all of that working. We're going to be doing this over 150 frames, so we need to work with our fuse wire and we need to work with the end growth. We can record at frame 0 at 100% for the end growth and then come through to 150 frames, which is the start of our explosion. And then we can drop this down to 0 and record our end growth there. Moving on from here, we need to work with our position from our align to spline, which is on the sphere, which of course is the fuse end, and we'll call that fuse end. Might as well do that. Okay. Again, at frame 0, we can record at 100%, so we'll record there. Move through to 150 frames. Set this to 0% and record there. And that should now be working, except it's not, because we can see that we've got this lag problem. Now, what we need to do to solve that is work with the spline. Now, at the moment, we've got a Bezier spline. What I'd like to use is a cubic spline, so we'll change that to cubic. And also, we can see that we've got this almost linear thing going on here. We don't want adaptive. We'll make this uniform, and straight away we get a change, but we'll also add some more to this number value. So we'll make that 200, and that will really smooth the spline out. Now let's see what happens when we move through the timeline. And we can see now that everything is matching and it's all aligned correctly. Now that's superb. That's exactly what we want. Fantastic. That's doing what we need it to do. So we've got our keyframe animation for our fuse wire and our fuse end completely sorted out. The next thing that we need to work with will be thinking particles, and for that we'll be working with Expresso. So let's get a null. We'll rename it Expresso. Give it the Expresso tag. We've got the window open and we're ready to start work. The first thing that we can bring in will be the fuse wire. So we'll drag that in. At the output stage, we'll give it an end growth port. Our next node will be a compare, and we can plumb the output of the end growth into the input number 1. And our function simply needs to be greater than, and we can leave our parameter as 0. So all the time we're greater than 0, we want a 1 at the output. Moving on from here, we need to work with our particles. So let's bring in our thinking particles. We'll get what do we want? A generator? Yes, well, we want a P matter waves. And at the input stage, we will give it an on port. So we want to be generating particles all the time our end growth is greater than 0. We can then give ourselves a P group. So we'll come down to thinking particles, standard P group, plumb the output of the P matter waves into the input port. Now let's just go into thinking particles settings and we'll drag this into here. I'd just like to do that as a matter of course. Okay, great. So we've got that set up so far. The next thing we need is a P pass node. So we'll bring one of those in. We'll drag once again the all group into here. And then finally, we need another node, but before we actually get there, we need to bring in another sphere. We'll call this sparks. Drop it just above our fuse end. And this is what we'll use to actually give our particles some geometry. So this particular sphere we need to give it a radius of 0.5. We can leave it as it is for the rest of its parameters. We don't need to change anything there. And then back in our Expresso, we can bring in a P-shape node. So we can come down to standard P-shape, drop this here, and once again we need an object, so we can drag sparks into here, and the bounding radius we can make 0. And then all we need to do is connect the P-pass to the P-shape. Okay, the final step is to work with the P matter waves and get this set up correctly. Now for a start we need fuse end to be the object, and we need to bring the selection that we created into here. Okay, let's see where we are. We do need count, but we'll give it a count of 150. The life, it only wants to be about 15 frames, and we'll give it a variation of 30%. The speed we can make 200, and once again a variation of 30%. And then finally we can work with our size, and this needs to be small, so 2, and again a variation of 30%. And that should be all we need to do. That should work fine. Let's just close this down, run the timeline and see what we get. And we can see straight away that we are getting the result that we want. If we just reframe and see where we are. Yeah, I mean, if we run that, we're getting something quite nice. And that's working. That's giving us the effect that I'm looking for. Fantastic. So we're set up thus far, and we can continue now. And all we need now to really sell this is Pyro. We need to get that in, and we need to get it set up. And that's our next step. We need to give the Pyro tag to our Boulder. So we'll select that and give it the Pyro emitter. We will also, just put that there, we'll also give it a collider tag. So we want one of those, we'll bring that in. And we want the fragments to actually collide with the smoke and fire that's produced by the Pyro tag. Another thing that we need actually is a Pyro output, and we haven't got that, and we need a simulation scene, so we'll grab one of those. We just bring a simulation scene in. In here we've got create output object for Pyro, so we can click on that, and now we've got those two set up. We'll just bring that down here. Okay, let's start working with this Pyro tag. The first thing we need to do is add 2 substeps, and the thickness we can change to 3, and then we can worry about our emission map here, and that's this selection that we created earlier on the Boulder. We'll bring that in, and now we're going to only generate flames and smoke from the inside faces of each of the fragments. That's what I want to do. Moving on from here, we'll look at our density. We'll just put 1 in the density set and leave the density add at 10, so that just gives us a bit more smoke. The temperature set we can leave at 4000. We'll make the temperature add 1100. So that's about as much as we need to do with our tag. With our Pyro output, a little bit different, we need to do a bit more. So our voxel size, we can just make that 4. You can go lower if you wish, but I don't want to go too low because my machine won't render down if I go too low, because we just haven't got the VRAM, but that's fine. 4 will do nicely. The substeps will make 2. And then we can look at what we've got here. Now the density, the relative density dissipation, I'm going to make that 0.5. Leave the absolute at 0.01, and I'm not going to touch anything else actually in there. And then in the temperature here, the relative temperature dissipation, I will also make that 0.5. And the absolute, I'm going to make 0.75. So just a little bit smaller. And I think that's about as much as we need to do in there. We can leave the rest as it is. So we've got those 2 things all set up and ready to go. But in order to make it work properly, we've got to reach for Expresso once again. So let's go into our window and see what we can do with this. We need to bring in a knot. So from our bool menu here, we'll grab a knot, plumb the output of the compare into the input. And then finally, we just need to bring the pyro emitter tag into the window here. And at the input stage, we need to come into tag properties and select enabled. And that will mean that as soon as our fuse has burnt out, our explosion will take place and we'll start generating flames and smoke. Okay, let's see if this works. Brief pause while it sets itself up, and then away it goes. And we can see that that's working really nicely. We've got a huge explosion there. We need to frame differently, but that's not a problem. We can just zoom out a little bit so that we can frame everything up. And we can see that that's working really, really nicely. And that collider tag is making quite a difference because we're getting these nice bubbles of smoke as the fragments of our boulder are passing through the smoke and causing it to move around. That's looking really nice. Yeah. Okay, we can see that that works beautifully. I mean, the last couple of steps, if you wish to do it, and if you want to render, of course, you will need to add a pyro volume to your pyro output. So in here, you just need to come into your materials, grab a hold of your pyro volume, and then add that. I'm not going to bother here. It's just not worth it for the sake of the tutorial. I'll leave it to you to play around with that. And you can also decide to cache, if you wish, your scene with your pyro. So you can do that as well. They're the final two steps that you can make. Now, just before I end the tutorial, what I will show you is a little video that I made. It's by no means the finished product, but it'll give you an idea of what the final thing might look like. And I'll just run that for you now. And it does give us quite a nice looking result, as you can see. Now, before I finally do bring this to a close, there's one last thing that I need to do. I did actually miss a step. Did you notice what it was? Yeah, I should have brought in a TP geometry. So from our thinking particles, I should bring one of these in, just drop it down here. And in the particle group, once again, I need to go into simulate, come down to thinking particles, settings, and just drag in the all group into here. And that just gives us our geometry with actual spheres here now. And if we were to render that, and we could also, of course, put a texture onto our sparks here, just come into here, grab a new material, and just from the emission, we don't need any color. What I would do is just take that down as well. We don't need reflection, but in the emission, I would just give this a really bright texture. It's something like, say, an orange color, and then just make it really bright, much brighter than that, about 20, so that it really is ultra bright. And then just drop this onto sparks, and it should then give you the result that you want with the actual geometry there. So we just take a quick render, just see what we're getting, see if it's actually doing anything. Is it? Yes, it is. And you can see that they're now sparks. So that's all you need to do there. That just finishes it off. Okay, fantastic. So we've got everything done, and I can now sign off. And that brings us to the end of this tutorial, because I've shown you everything I wanted to show you in this one. So as always, I really hope you've enjoyed doing this particular tutorial, and if you have enjoyed the video, please give it a like, and if you haven't already, please subscribe to the channel, leave a comment, and of course ring the bell. And wherever you happen to be on social media, please do share this video, because all this good stuff really does help keep the channel moving in the right direction. But anyway, that just about brings the curtain down on this one, so I'll see you very soon on the next tutorial.